In the vast expanse of Montana's rolling hills, where cattle roam freely under endless skies and the nearest neighbor lives 20 miles away, secrets have a way of festering in silence. Ranch owner Jake Morrison had grown accustomed to solitude, to the rhythm of sunrise chores and sunset reflections. But when he noticed his new housekeeper Sarah couldn't walk in a straight line, he assumed she'd been drinking on the job. What he discovered instead would shake him to his core and force the local sheriff to question everything he thought he knew about justice in their small town. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from and if this story touches you. Make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The dust hadn't settled from the departing pickup truck when Jake Morrison first laid eyes on Sarah Chun, the woman who would unknowingly turn his orderly world upside down. It was a scorching Tuesday in July 2018, the kind of day when the Montana sun seemed to press down on the earth with deliberate cruelty, making even the hardiest ranchers seek shade during the afternoon hours. Jake stood on the wraparound porch of his sprawling ranch house, a structure his grandfather had built in 1952 with timber from their own land and stones hauled from the creek bed that wound through their property. At 38, Jake had inherited more than just the 2,000-acre Morrison Ranch. He'd inherited the isolation that came with running a cattle operation in one of the most remote corners of Glacier County. Sarah stepped out of the battered Ford F-150 that belonged to Martha Henderson from the county employment office, her movements careful and deliberate in a way that immediately caught Jake's attention. She was younger than he'd expected, probably in her late 20s, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and clothes that suggested she understood the demands of physical labor. But there was something else, something in the way. She gripped the truck's doorframe before stepping down, the slight hesitation in her gait as she walked toward the porch. "Mr. Morrison," Sarah said, extending her hand with a firm grip that surprised him. "I'm Sarah Chun," Mrs. Henderson said. "You were looking for household help." Jake noticed her voice carried traces of an accent he couldn't quite place, though her English was perfect. What struck him more was the way she seemed to favor her left side, a subtle shift in posture that became more apparent as she stood in the afternoon heat. "Just Jake," he replied, studying her face for signs of the problems that had plagued his previous attempts at hiring domestic help. The ranch's isolation had driven away 3 housekeepers in the past 2 years. One had lasted only a week before complaining about the creepy silence and the 40-minute drive to the nearest grocery store. Another had been convinced the house was haunted after hearing the old timber settling during winter nights. Sarah's eyes held a different quality than his previous employees. Where others had shown curiosity or apprehension about the remote location, Sarah's expression suggested relief, as if the isolation offered exactly what she was seeking. Mrs. Henderson explained the position. Sarah continued, shifting her weight, again in that subtle way that made Jake wonder if she was injured. "Room and board, plus salary, in exchange for maintaining the house, preparing meals, and general domestic duties. She mentioned you run cattle and work long days." Jake nodded, still trying to identify what seemed off about her posture. "That's right. The house is big enough that you'd have your own space completely separate from mine. The work isn't particularly difficult, but it needs to be consistent. I'm usually out before dawn and don't come in until after sunset, especially during calving season." As they talked, Jake observed Sarah's responses to questions about her experience and references. She'd worked for families in Billings and Great Falls, always in temporary positions, always moving on after a few months. Her references were solid but brief, praising her efficiency and reliability while noting her preference for privacy. "The nearest town is Cedar Ridge," Jake explained, gesturing toward the dirt road that disappeared into rolling hills. "Population 800 on a good day. The grocery store closes at 6 and the diner shuts down at 8. If you're looking for nightlife or entertainment, This isn't the place." "I'm not," Sarah said quickly, perhaps too quickly. "I prefer quiet places. I like the idea of contributing to a working ranch." Jake led her through the house, a tour that revealed rooms filled with furniture covered in dust sheets and windows that hadn't been properly cleaned in months. The kitchen was functional, but showed signs of a bachelor's utilitarian approach to cooking. The living areas were spacious but sterile, lacking the warmth that comes from regular use and care. "The previous housekeeper left 3 months ago," Jake explained as they walked through the main hallway. "I've been managing on my own, but I'm afraid domestic maintenance isn't my strong suit." Sarah paused at the large front window that offered a panoramic view of the ranch's eastern pastures, where Black Angus cattle grazed in the distance. "It's beautiful," she said, and Jake heard genuine appreciation in her voice. "Peaceful." "Some would call it lonely," Jake replied, watching her reaction carefully. "The winters can be particularly challenging. We sometimes go weeks without seeing another soul." "Sometimes that's exactly what a person needs," Sarah said, her fingers absently touching her lower back in a gesture so quick Jake almost missed it. They discussed practical matters: salary, work schedule, use of the ranch's pickup truck for trips to town. Sarah accepted the terms without negotiation, which surprised Jake. Most potential employees tried to negotiate better pay or more time off. Sarah seemed more concerned with confirming that her quarters would be private and that she wouldn't be expected to entertain visitors or participate in social functions. "I should mention," Jake said as they concluded their tour, "I occasionally have business associates visit the ranch. Nothing fancy, just cattle buyers or veterinarians. I'd need the house to be presentable for those occasions." "Of course," Sarah agreed. "When would you like me to start?" "Tomorrow, if that works for you. Mrs. Henderson said you were available immediately." Sarah nodded, though Jake noticed she seemed to steel herself before agreeing, as if the decision required more effort than it should have. "Tomorrow is perfect." After Martha Henderson's truck disappeared down the dusty road, taking Sarah to collect her belongings from the motel where she'd been staying, Jake found himself standing alone on his porch, wondering what he'd gotten himself into. There had been something in Sarah's eagerness to accept the position that went beyond normal employment enthusiasm. She hadn't asked about local medical facilities or social opportunities, questions that had been among the first concerns of his previous housekeepers. Jake's ranch sat in a valley, surrounded by rolling hills that stretched to the horizon in every direction. The main house commanded a view of the entire operation, the red barn that housed equipment and served as shelter during harsh weather, the series of pastures divided by wooden fencing that his father had installed in the 1980s, and the creek that provided water for both the cattle and the house. The Morrison family had worked this land for 3 generations. Jake's grandfather, Samuel Morrison, had purchased the original 800 acres in 1952 after returning from the Korean War with savings and a determination to build something lasting. Samuel's son, Jake's father Robert, had expanded the operation and modernized the facilities before his death in a farming accident 5 years earlier. Jake had inherited not just the ranch but the weight of continuing a family legacy. At 38, he was successful by most measures. The ranch turned a solid profit. His cattle consistently brought top prices at market, and he'd earned respect among his peers in the ranching community. But success came with a price that became more apparent with each passing year: the isolation that his grandfather had sought as a refuge from the complexities of post-war society had become Jake's prison. Relationships were difficult to maintain when the nearest town was 40 minutes away, and ranch work demanded attention 7 days a week. Jake's marriage to college sweetheart Linda had ended 4 years earlier, a casualty of his unwillingness to consider selling the ranch and moving somewhere with better social opportunities. "You love those cattle more than you love me," Linda had said during their final argument, and Jake hadn't been able to convince her she was wrong. Since the divorce, Jake had thrown himself into ranch work with an intensity that worried his few close friends. He rose before dawn to check cattle, spent days repairing fencing and maintaining equipment, and fell into bed exhausted each night. The routine provided structure and purpose, but it also served as a barrier against the loneliness that threatened to overwhelm him during quiet moments. Hiring household help had been a practical decision rather than a social one. Jake could manage basic cooking and cleaning, but the house required more attention than he could provide while maintaining the ranch. Previous housekeepers had been temporary solutions at best, women from town who found the isolation unbearable, or who viewed the position as a stepping stone to something better. Sarah Chun seemed different, though Jake couldn't articulate exactly how. Her acceptance of the ranch's isolation suggested she was running from something rather than towards something. But Jake understood that motivation better than most. Sometimes, the middle of nowhere was exactly where a person needed to be. The next morning, Jake rose at his usual 4:30 a.m. and completed his morning chores before Sarah's arrival. He checked cattle in the east pasture, ensuring water systems were functioning properly, and repaired a section of fence that the cattle had tested during the night. By 7 a.m., he was back at the house, surprised to find smoke rising from the kitchen chimney. Sarah had arrived earlier than expected and was already preparing breakfast when Jake entered through the back door. The kitchen smelled of coffee and bacon, scents that hadn't filled the house regularly since his father's time. Sarah moved around the kitchen with efficient confidence, though Jake noticed she moved carefully, always maintaining contact with counters or walls as she navigated between stove and sink. "Morning," Jake said, hanging his hat on the hook beside the door. "You're up early." "I'm an early riser," Sarah replied, not turning from the stove where she was tending to what appeared to be a more elaborate breakfast than Jake had enjoyed in months. "I hope you don't mind that I started without asking. I wanted to have coffee ready when you came in." Jake poured himself a cup from the pot Sarah had prepared, noting that it was considerably better than his usual effort. "Smells good in here. It's been a while since this kitchen saw proper use." Sarah set a plate before him containing eggs, bacon, hash browns, and toast, a ranch breakfast that reminded Jake of meals his mother used to prepare before her death when he was 12. But as Sarah moved to serve her own plate, Jake observed the same careful movement he'd noticed the day before, a subtle favoring of her left side that suggested chronic pain or injury. "Everything all right?" Jake asked, trying to sound casual. "You seem to be moving a bit carefully this morning." Sarah's hand froze momentarily before she continued reaching for her coffee cup. "Just stiff from sleeping in an unfamiliar bed. I'll adjust." The explanation was reasonable, but something in Sarah's tone suggested it wasn't entirely truthful. Jake had spent enough time around injured animals to recognize the signs of someone managing chronic discomfort. Cattle hiding injuries could be dangerous to themselves and others, but Jake sensed that pressing Sarah for details would only make her more guarded. They ate in comfortable silence, the only sounds coming from the kitchen clock and the distant lowing of cattle beginning their day. Through the window, Jake could see the sun climbing over the eastern hills, promising another day of relentless heat. "I'll be working on the irrigation system in the south pasture today," Jake said as he prepared to leave. "If you need anything from town, make a list. I'll be heading to Cedar Ridge tomorrow for supplies." Sarah nodded, already beginning to clear the breakfast dishes. "I'll spend today getting familiar with the house and establishing routines. Is there anything particular you'd like me to focus on?" Jake looked around the kitchen, noting how much more welcoming it felt with Sarah's presence. "Just make it feel like a home again. It's been a long time since this place had that quality." As Jake headed out for his day's work, he found himself looking forward to returning home in a way he hadn't experienced since Linda left. The prospect of walking into a warm kitchen with the smell of dinner cooking and the sense that someone else shared the space represented a comfort he'd almost forgotten existed. But the image of Sarah's careful movement stayed with him as he worked, a puzzle that his mind couldn't quite solve. There was more to his new housekeeper than she was revealing, and Jake's instincts suggested that whatever Sarah was hiding might be more serious than simple privacy preferences. The sun climbed higher as Jake lost himself in the familiar rhythm of ranch work, but in the back of his mind, he remained aware that Sarah Chun had brought more than just domestic skills to the Morrison Ranch. She'd brought a mystery that would soon test everything Jake thought he knew about trust, protection, and the lengths a person would go to escape their past. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 3 weeks into Sarah's employment at the Morrison Ranch, Jake began noticing patterns that didn't make sense. It started with small observations that individually seemed insignificant, but collectively painted a picture of someone living with careful, practiced deception. The first anomaly Jake noticed was Sarah's relationship with stairs. The ranch house had a grand staircase leading to the second floor, where guest bedrooms and Jake's father's old office remained largely unused. Sarah's quarters were on the ground floor, strategically chosen to avoid unnecessary climbing, but occasionally her duties required trips upstairs for cleaning or maintenance. Jake observed that Sarah always gripped the handrail with both hands when ascending stairs, moving one step at a time with deliberate precision. Most people climbed stairs in a natural rhythm, alternating feet without conscious thought. Sarah's approach suggested someone compensating for balance issues or muscle weakness, though she tried to disguise her careful movements whenever Jake was nearby. The second pattern emerged during their weekly trips to Cedar Ridge for supplies. Sarah invariably volunteered to handle grocery shopping while Jake visited the feed store and hardware supplier. Initially, Jake appreciated her efficiency and thorough shopping lists, but he began noticing that Sarah always requested to be dropped off at the grocery store's main entrance and picked up at the same location, never suggesting they meet at his truck in the parking lot. One afternoon, Jake finished his errands earlier than expected and decided to help Sarah load groceries. He found her in the store's pharmacy section, deep in conversation with elderly pharmacist Harold Walsh. Sarah was showing Harold what appeared to be a prescription bottle, speaking in hushed tones while Harold examined the label with a concerned expression. "Everything all right?" Jake asked, approaching from behind. Sarah spun around with startled quickness that sent her off balance, grabbing the pharmacy counter for support. The prescription bottle fell to the floor, and Jake instinctively reached to retrieve it. The label was partially torn, but he caught a glimpse of text that included muscle relaxant and pain management before Sarah quickly snatched it back. "Just asking about over-the-counter supplements," Sarah said, her voice tight with forced casualness. Harold was explaining different vitamin options. Harold Walsh, who had known Jake since childhood, gave him a meaningful look but said nothing. The old pharmacist had served the community for 40 years and understood the importance of medical privacy, but his expression suggested concern beyond routine vitamin consultation. During the drive home, Sarah remained unusually quiet, staring out the passenger window at the passing landscape. Jake wanted to ask about the prescription, but sensed that direct questions would only make her more guarded. Instead, he found himself studying her profile, noting the tension around her eyes and the way she braced herself against the truck's door whenever they hit bumps in the road. "Harold's a good man," Jake said finally. "He's helped a lot of people in this community over the years. Knows how to keep confidences when necessary." Sarah turned to look at him, and Jake saw something that might have been gratitude in her expression. "I'm sure he is. Small-town pharmacists usually are." That evening, Jake worked later than usual. In the barn, ostensibly organizing tack and equipment, but actually giving himself time to think about what he'd witnessed. Sarah's careful movements, her obvious pain management needs, and her nervousness about being discovered with prescription medication suggested serious health issues she was determined to hide. Jake understood the impulse toward privacy about medical matters, but Sarah's secrecy seemed to go beyond normal discretion. She was actively concealing something that caused significant physical limitations, and Jake worried that whatever she was hiding might be dangerous if left untreated. The third pattern Jake identified was Sarah's relationship with phone calls. The ranch house had an old landline that Jake rarely used except for business calls, but he'd given Sarah permission to use it for personal communications. What struck Jake as odd was that Sarah never seemed to receive incoming calls, only made occasional outgoing ones, always when she thought Jake was out of earshot. One evening, Jake returned to the house unexpectedly after discovering broken water lines in the north pasture. As he approached the back door, he heard Sarah's voice through the kitchen window, speaking in urgent, hushed tones. "No, I can't come back yet," Sarah was saying. "The doctor said I need at least 6 more weeks of physical therapy before we can even consider." Her voice trailed off as she noticed Jake's shadow at the window. By the time Jake entered the kitchen, Sarah had ended her call and was busy preparing dinner, but her hands shook slightly as she worked at the stove. Jake pretended not to notice her agitation, but the overheard conversation confirmed his growing suspicion that Sarah was recovering from something serious, something that required ongoing medical attention. "Everything all right?" Jake asked, washing his hands at the sink. "Of course," Sarah replied, but her voice lacked its usual steady confidence. "Dinner will be ready in 20 minutes. How was your afternoon?" Jake described the waterline problems while watching Sarah's reflection in the kitchen window. She moved with her characteristic caution, but tonight her movements seemed more labored, as if the stress of the phone conversation had intensified whatever physical challenges she was managing. Over dinner, Jake found himself studying Sarah more carefully than before. She was an attractive woman, probably in her late 20s, with intelligent dark eyes and the kind of practical competence that Jake associated with people who had learned to rely on themselves. But underneath her calm exterior, Jake sensed a wariness that suggested someone accustomed to looking over her shoulder. "Can I ask you something?" Jake said as they finished eating. Sarah's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "Of course. Are you running from something?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Sarah set down her fork and studied Jake's face, clearly weighing how much truth she could afford to reveal. "What makes you ask that?" "A lot of things," Jake said honestly. "The way you accepted this job without negotiating terms. The fact that you don't seem to have any personal belongings beyond what fits in a single suitcase. The way you watch the road whenever cars pass by, like you're expecting someone you don't want to see." Sarah was quiet for so long that Jake wondered if she would answer at all. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Everyone's running from something, Jake. Some people run from loneliness, some from failure, some from expectations they can't meet. The question isn't whether someone is running, but whether they're running towards something better or just running." It was a non-answer that somehow felt more honest than a direct response would have been. Jake nodded, understanding that Sarah had shared as much as she was capable of sharing at that moment. "For what it's worth," Jake said, "this seems like a good place to catch your breath, whatever you're dealing with." Sarah's smile was the first completely genuine expression Jake had seen from her since her arrival. "Thank you. That means more than you know." Later that evening, as Jake completed his nightly security check of the ranch facilities, he found himself thinking about Sarah's words. Everyone was indeed running from something, and Jake had to acknowledge that his own choice to remain isolated on the ranch was its own form of flight from the complexities of modern relationships and social expectations. But Sarah's situation felt different, more urgent somehow. The prescription medications, the physical therapy references, the constant vigilance, these suggested someone recovering from trauma rather than simply seeking solitude. Jake began to worry that whatever Sarah was running from might eventually catch up with her, and when it did, the ranch's isolation could become a liability rather than an asset. The fourth pattern Jake identified was perhaps the most concerning. Sarah had developed a routine of walking the perimeter of the ranch house each evening before sunset, ostensibly to enjoy the fresh air and exercise. But Jake noticed that these walks always followed the same route and always included strategic positions that offered clear views of the access road from multiple angles. One evening, Jake decided to observe Sarah's walk from the barn, positioning himself where he could watch without being obvious. Sarah moved along her usual route, but instead of the leisurely stroll she presented when Jake was nearby, she walked with purpose and constant awareness of her surroundings. She paused at corners to scan the horizon, used reflective surfaces to check behind herself, and consistently positioned herself near potential cover. The behavior was consistent with someone conducting security reconnaissance, the kind of cautious awareness that suggested either military training or experience with genuine threats. Jake had served briefly in the Army after high school and recognized the tactical thinking behind Sarah's evening routines. That night, Jake lay awake listening to the familiar sounds of the ranch settling around him. The old house creaked and sighed as temperatures dropped, cattle moved restlessly in distant pastures, and coyotes called to each other across the valley. But for the first time since Sarah's arrival, Jake found these familiar sounds unsettling rather than comforting. If Sarah was conducting security assessments of the ranch, it suggested she was expecting trouble. Jake began to wonder what kind of danger could drive someone to seek refuge in such an isolated location, and whether his decision to hire Sarah might have inadvertently placed both of them at risk. The next morning brought an unusually heavy rainstorm that turned the ranch's dirt roads into muddy obstacles and drove the cattle to seek shelter in the barn. Jake spent the morning moving hay and ensuring the animals remained comfortable, but his mind kept returning to questions about Sarah's background and the nature of whatever threat she was anticipating. When Jake returned to the house for lunch, he found Sarah standing at the living room window with a pair of binoculars, scanning the valley with intense concentration. She lowered the binoculars quickly when she heard his footsteps, but not before Jake noticed the practiced way she handled the equipment. "Storms got the wildlife stirred up," Sarah said, attempting to explain her surveillance. "I thought I saw a bear near the creek." Jake accepted the explanation without comment, but he knew there were no bears in their immediate area, and Sarah's focused attention had been directed toward the access road rather than the creek. The binoculars themselves were military-grade equipment, far more sophisticated than anything needed for casual wildlife observation. That afternoon, while Sarah worked inside the house, Jake drove to Cedar Ridge to visit Sheriff Marcus Webb. Marcus was an old family friend who had known Jake since childhood, and Jake trusted his judgment about people and situations that might pose threats to the community. "Marcus," Jake said, settling into the chair across from the sheriff's desk, "what do you know about background checks for domestic employees?" Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying Jake with the careful attention of someone trained to read between the lines. "Planning to hire someone?" "Already did, 3 weeks ago. Woman named Sarah Chun. Came through the county employment office. Good worker, no complaints, but double quotes, but." Jake described his observations about Sarah's behavior, careful to present facts rather than speculation. Marcus listened without interruption, occasionally taking notes in the small notebook he always carried. "Sounds like someone with security training," Marcus said when Jake finished. "Or someone who's learned to be careful the hard way. Either way, it suggests she's dealing with something more serious than normal employment challenges." "That's what I'm worried about," Jake admitted. "The ranch is isolated enough that if trouble comes looking for her, We'd be on our own until help could arrive. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. I'll make some discreet inquiries. See if there are any outstanding warrants or missing person reports that might fit her description. But Jake, if she's running from domestic violence or stalking, sometimes isolation is exactly what someone needs to stay safe. The conversation with Marcus clarified Jake's thinking about Sarah's situation. Whether she was running from legal troubles or personal threats, her presence at the ranch represented a complication that Jake hadn't anticipated when he'd hired household help. But it also represented a responsibility that Jake couldn't simply abandon, regardless of the potential risks involved. Driving home through the continuing rainstorm, Jake made a decision that would change everything about his relationship with Sarah Chun. Instead of continuing to observe and speculate about her secrets, he would find a way to earn her trust sufficiently that she would feel safe sharing the truth about whatever had driven her to seek refuge at the Morrison Ranch. The decision felt right, but Jake understood that it also meant accepting responsibility for whatever consequences might follow from Sarah's past catching up with her present. The opportunity Jake had been waiting for came unexpectedly on a Thursday morning in late August when Sarah collapsed in the kitchen while preparing breakfast. Jake heard the crash of dishes from the barn where he was loading feed supplements, and he arrived at the house to find Sarah on the floor, conscious but unable to stand, her face pale with pain and embarrassment. "Don't," Sarah said firmly when Jake moved to help her up. "Just give me a minute." Jake knelt beside her, noting the way her left leg was positioned awkwardly and the tremor in her hands as she tried to steady herself against the kitchen cabinet. "Sarah, you need medical attention. Let me drive you to the clinic in town." "No doctors," Sarah said with vehement intensity that surprised Jake. "Please, I just need to rest for a moment." But Jake could see that this wasn't a momentary dizzy spell or simple exhaustion. Sarah's breathing was labored, and she kept trying to massage her left hip with movements that suggested chronic nerve pain rather than acute injury. After 10 minutes, she still couldn't stand without assistance. "All right," Jake said, making a decision that would force them both to confront the truth they'd been dancing around for weeks. "No doctors. But I'm carrying you to your room, and we're going to talk about what's really going on here." Sarah started to protest, but Jake was already lifting her carefully, noting how little she weighed and how her body tensed involuntarily at certain movements. He carried her to her ground-floor bedroom, a space he'd never entered, but which he now observed was meticulously organized with medical supplies, prescription bottles, and what appeared to be physical therapy equipment. "Sarah," Jake said gently, settling her onto the bed, "whatever's going on, hiding it isn't working anymore. Let me help." For a long moment, Sarah stared at the ceiling, her hands clenched into fists as she waged some internal battle. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the exhaustion of someone who had been carrying a secret too heavy for one person to bear alone. "6 months ago, I was a detective with the Billings Police Department," she began, her words measured and careful. "I'd been working undercover for 8 months, investigating a human trafficking ring that was using legitimate businesses as fronts for moving victims across state lines." Jake settled into the chair beside Sarah's bed, understanding that whatever she was about to tell him would explain everything he'd observed about her behavior and her need for isolation. "The operation was run by a man named Vincent Torres," Sarah continued. "He owned a chain of truck stops and restaurants along I-90, and he was using them to transport women and children who'd been kidnapped or sold into slavery. My job was to pose as a waitress at one of his restaurants and gather evidence about the trafficking routes and the people involved." Sarah paused, closing her eyes as if the memory itself caused physical pain. "Torres was suspicious from the beginning. He had sources in law enforcement, and he started testing me, giving me tasks that weren't part of normal restaurant work. By the time I realized my cover was blown, it was too late to extract safely." Jake felt his stomach clench as he began to understand the magnitude of what Sarah had endured. What happened? Torres and 3 of his men cornered me in the restaurant's storage room after closing time. They wanted information about the police investigation, names of other undercover officers, details about what evidence we'd collected. Sarah's voice became clinical, detached, as if she was reading from a police report, rather than describing her own trauma. They tortured me for 6 hours before my backup team realized something was wrong and came looking for me. By then, Torres had damaged my spinal cord and left me for dead in a drainage ditch outside of town. The clinical language couldn't disguise the horror of what Sarah was describing, and Jake found himself gripping the chair arms to control his anger at people he'd never met but already considered enemies. The doctor said I was lucky to survive, Sarah continued. Lucky to walk at all. But the spinal injuries caused permanent nerve damage in my left leg and hip. Some days are better than others, but I'll never be completely normal again. Jake understood now why Sarah moved so carefully, why she gripped railings and avoided uneven surfaces, why she needed prescription pain medication and physical therapy. But he still didn't understand why she was hiding on his ranch instead of receiving proper medical care. What happened to Torres? Jake asked. Sarah's expression hardened with bitter satisfaction. Dead. He was killed in federal prison while awaiting trial. Apparently, child traffickers aren't popular with other inmates. But if he's dead, why are you still hiding? Because Torres was part of a larger organization, and several of his associates are still operating. During my interrogation, I saw faces and heard names that weren't part of our original investigation. I have information that could shut down trafficking operations across 3 states, but I also know that some of Torres's people are still looking for me. Sarah struggled to sit up straighter, wincing with the effort. The FBI wanted to put me in witness protection, but that would mean giving up my identity permanently and living under constant supervision. I chose instead to disappear on my own terms, to find somewhere I could recover while staying off their radar. The pieces of Sarah's behavior finally made complete sense to Jake. Her security awareness, her reluctance to seek medical attention, her nervousness about being discovered. All of it was the result of living with a target on her back while managing serious injuries that required ongoing treatment. How long do you think you'll need to stay hidden? Jake asked. The FBI is still building cases against the other members of Torres's network. They estimate it could take another year or 2 before everyone is arrested and prosecuted. Until then, I'm safer if I don't officially exist. Jake absorbed this information while studying Sarah's face, noting the relief in her expression now that she'd shared her burden. But he also recognized new concerns that her revelation had created. Sarah, if these people are as dangerous as you're describing, then staying here might be putting both of us at risk. The ranch is isolated, but it's not invisible if they're really looking for you. I know, Sarah said quietly. I've been careful about covering my tracks, using false names and paying cash for everything. But you're right that my presence here could endanger you. If you want me to leave. That's not what I'm saying, Jake interrupted. What I'm saying is that if you're going to stay, we need to be smarter about security. And you need proper medical care, even if we have to be creative about how we arrange it. Sarah's eyes filled with tears she'd been holding back for months. Jake, you don't understand what you'd be getting into. These aren't just local criminals. Torres's organization had connections to Mexican cartels, Russian organized crime, international networks that have resources and reach beyond anything you've dealt with. Then it's a good thing I'm not dealing with them alone, Jake replied. Sheriff Webb is an old family friend, and he has contacts with federal law enforcement. If we're going to do this right, we need professional help. For the first time since her collapse, Sarah smiled genuinely. You're serious about this. You're willing to help someone you barely know, knowing it could put you in danger. Sarah, in the past month, you've turned this house into a home again. You've made me remember what it feels like to have someone to talk to at the end of the day. Someone who cares whether I come back safely from working with the cattle. I'm not about to let some criminals destroy that because they think they can. Intimidate people into silence. Jake stood up, his mind already working through the practical implications of Sarah's situation. But first, we need to get you proper medical attention. Can you describe what treatments you need? Sarah reached for a notebook on her bedside table, flipping to a page covered with medical terminology and appointment schedules. Physical therapy 3 times a week, pain management consultations monthly, and MRI scans every 3 months to monitor spinal healing. I've been driving to different towns and using fake names, but it's getting harder to manage without raising suspicions. Dr. Martinez in Cedar Ridge is discreet and competent, Jake said. Her practice serves ranchers and farmers who sometimes need off-the-books medical care for immigration or insurance reasons. If I explain the situation, she might be willing to help. Over the next hour, Jake and Sarah developed a plan that would allow her to receive proper medical care while maintaining the security she needed. Dr. Martinez would treat Sarah under an assumed name, with payments made in cash through Jake's ranch account. Sheriff Webb would be brought into their confidence, but would limit his involvement to providing early warning if federal investigations in the area required Sarah to relocate quickly. Most importantly, Jake would modify the ranch's security arrangements to provide better protection without advertising Sarah's presence. Motion sensors around the perimeter, improved locks on doors and windows, and a communication system that would allow them to contact help if needed. There's something else, Sarah said as they finalized their arrangements. The physical therapy equipment I need is expensive, and my savings won't last much longer. I can't keep accepting your help without contributing something meaningful in return. Jake had been thinking about this issue as well. Sarah's law enforcement background and investigative skills were valuable assets that could benefit the ranch in ways beyond housekeeping. Actually, I've been thinking about expanding the ranch's operations, Jake said. There's been talk in the Ranchers Association about problems with cattle theft and equipment vandalism. Someone with your background could help develop security protocols for ranch operations throughout the county. It would be legitimate consulting work that could generate income while keeping you connected to law enforcement resources. Sarah's expression brightened as she considered the possibilities. That could work. It would also give me a reason to stay in contact with federal agencies without raising suspicions about my personal situation. By afternoon, Jake had contacted Dr. Martinez and Sheriff Webb, explaining Sarah's situation in general terms and requesting their assistance. Both had agreed to help, understanding that domestic violence and witness protection cases sometimes required creative solutions to ensure victim safety. Dr. Martinez scheduled Sarah for a comprehensive medical evaluation the following week, while Sheriff Webb began reaching out to federal contacts who could provide guidance about ongoing investigations into trafficking networks. That evening, as Sarah rested in her room and Jake completed his ranch duties, he reflected on how dramatically his life had changed in a single day. The lonely routine that had defined his existence for years had been replaced by a sense of purpose and responsibility that felt both challenging and energizing. But Jake also understood that their decision to work together had committed both of them to a dangerous path. Sarah's enemies were still out there, still searching for her, and now Jake had made himself a target as well. The isolation that had once protected him from emotional complications now represented a vulnerability that could prove deadly if Torres's associates discovered Sarah's location. As darkness settled over the ranch, Jake found himself looking at the landscape differently than he had for years. Instead of seeing peaceful pastures and familiar hills, he now saw potential hiding places for threats in strategic positions that would need to be defended. If Sarah's past came calling, the transformation felt like awakening from a long sleep. And despite the dangers involved, Jake realized he felt more alive than he had in years. 2 months after Sarah's revelation transformed their relationship from employer and employee to allies in hiding, life at the Morrison Ranch had settled into a new rhythm that balanced security concerns with the practical demands of running a cattle operation. Jake had implemented discreet security improvements while Sarah's health improved dramatically under Dr. Martinez's care. But neither of them expected their carefully constructed sanctuary to be tested so soon. The first sign of trouble came on. A crisp October morning when Jake noticed fresh tire tracks near the main gate that didn't match any of the ranch's vehicles. The tracks were from high-performance tires, the kind found on expensive sports cars, rather than the pickup trucks and agricultural equipment that normally access the property. More concerning was the pattern of the tracks, which suggested someone had stopped to observe the ranch rather than simply driving past. Could be lost tourists, Sarah suggested when Jake showed her the impressions, but her expression indicated she didn't believe her own explanation. Or real estate agents showing property to potential buyers. Jake knelt beside the clearest tire impression, noting details that confirmed his growing suspicions. These tracks are from yesterday evening, probably just after sunset. And look. At this, he pointed to boot prints near the driver's side door. Whoever got out spent time studying the ranch layout, not just checking directions. Sarah examined the boot prints with the analytical eye of a trained investigator. The prints showed expensive Italian leather shoes with distinctive wear patterns. That suggested urban walking rather than rural outdoor activity. More troubling, the person had walked to several strategic observation points, clearly mapping the ranch's defensive vulnerabilities. "We need to contact Sheriff Webb," Sarah said, photographing the evidence with Jake's digital camera. "If Torres's people have found me, we'll need law enforcement backup." But Jake was already thinking beyond immediate tactical concerns. If Sarah's enemies had located the ranch, they would be conducting surveillance before attempting any direct action. The isolation that had protected Sarah for months could now trap them if they weren't careful about planning their response. "Before we call Webb, we need to consider our options," Jake said. "If these are Torres's associates, they'll be professional criminals with resources and connections. Running away might just delay the confrontation, and it could put other innocent people at risk." Sarah understood Jake's thinking, but her law enforcement training made her cautious about engaging dangerous criminals without proper backup. "Jake, these aren't cattle rustlers or local troublemakers. Torres's organization killed 3 police officers during my investigation, and they have access to military-grade weapons and surveillance equipment." That afternoon, Jake drove to town alone while Sarah remained at the ranch with strict instructions to stay armed and maintain radio contact. His destination was Webb's office, where he needed to brief the sheriff about the morning's discoveries and request immediate assistance from federal law enforcement contacts. Sheriff Marcus Webb listened to Jake's report with the focused attention of a professional lawman, taking detailed notes and asking specific questions about the tire tracks and boot prints. Webb had served as sheriff for 15 years and had dealt with organized crime investigations before, but Sarah's situation represented a level of danger that exceeded normal county law enforcement capabilities. "I've got some concerns about this, Jake," Webb said after reviewing the photographic evidence. "If these people have found Sarah, they're not going to approach this like a normal criminal investigation. They'll be looking to eliminate witnesses and recover any evidence she might have against their operations." Webb reached for his secure phone, dialing a number from memory. "I'm calling FBI agent Patricia Reeves in Great Falls. She's been coordinating federal investigations into trafficking networks, and she needs to know that Sarah's been compromised." The conversation with Agent Reeves confirmed Jake's worst fears. Federal intelligence indicated that several members of Torres's organization had been conducting systematic searches for Sarah throughout Montana and neighboring states. The FBI had been tracking their movements, but hadn't anticipated they would locate Sarah so quickly. "Agent Reeves is driving down tonight with a tactical team," Webb informed Jake. "They'll establish surveillance around your ranch and attempt to identify whoever's been watching Sarah, but she wants Sarah prepared to relocate immediately if the situation escalates." Jake felt his jaw tighten at the suggestion that Sarah should be forced to run again. What about standing and fighting? Sarah has information these criminals want, and she's willing to testify against them. Why should she have to spend the rest of her life hiding? "Because staying alive is more important than justice," Webb replied bluntly. "These people don't take prisoners, Jake. If they get their hands on Sarah, they'll torture her for information and then kill her. The FBI can build cases against trafficking networks without putting one witness at extraordinary risk." But as Jake drove back to the ranch, he found himself rejecting the federal law enforcement approach to Sarah's situation. Running away would only postpone the inevitable confrontation while giving Sarah's enemies time to improve their tracking methods and expand their search operations. More importantly, Sarah had already sacrificed her career and nearly her life to stop criminals who destroyed innocent people's lives. She deserved better than a lifetime of hiding from cowards who preyed on the vulnerable. Jake arrived at the ranch to find Sarah conducting her own security assessment, using binoculars to scan the surrounding hills for signs of continued surveillance. Her movements were more confident than they'd been since her collapse 2 months earlier, suggesting that proper medical care and physical therapy had restored much of her strength and mobility. "Any visitors while I was gone?" Jake asked, joining Sarah on the front porch. "Nothing obvious, but I've got a feeling we're being watched from the ridgeline to the east. The cattle in that pasture are more agitated than usual, and I caught glimpses of reflected light that could be optics or camera equipment." Jake studied the eastern ridge through his own binoculars, noting the ideal vantage point it provided for observing ranch activities. If professional criminals were conducting surveillance, they would choose positions that offered clear sight lines while remaining concealed from casual observation. "Webb's bringing in federal agents tonight," Jake reported. "They want to extract you before the situation gets worse." Sarah lowered her binoculars and turned to face Jake directly. "And what do you think we should do?" The question carried implications that went beyond immediate tactical decisions. Sarah was asking whether Jake was prepared to commit fully to helping her confront her enemies rather than simply facilitating her escape to another hiding place. "I think we've spent enough time running," Jake said. "These people have terrorized you for months, and they're not going to stop until someone makes them stop. If we're going to end this, it needs to happen here, on ground we know and control." Sarah's smile was fierce and determined, the expression of someone who had been waiting for an opportunity to fight back against people who had tried to destroy her life. "All right then. Let's discuss how we're going to turn the tables on whoever's watching us." Over the next several hours, Jake and Sarah developed a plan that would allow them to identify and confront Sarah's pursuers while maintaining the element of surprise. The ranch's layout provided natural advantages for defensive positioning, and Jake's knowledge of the terrain could be used to predict and control how any confrontation would unfold. Sarah's law enforcement training complemented Jake's practical experience with ranch security, creating a tactical partnership that neither could have achieved alone. They identified choke points where vehicles could be stopped, defensive positions that would provide cover during armed confrontation, and escape routes that could be used if their primary plan failed. Most importantly, they established communication protocols with Sheriff Webb and Agent Reeves that would bring professional backup without revealing their intentions to conduct offensive operations against Sarah's enemies. That evening, as darkness settled over the ranch, Jake and Sarah took positions that would allow them to observe anyone attempting to approach the house. Jake positioned himself in the barn with a clear view of the main access road, while Sarah covered the eastern approach from her bedroom window. At 11:30 p.m., Motion sensors Jake had installed around the property perimeter began registering movement. Near the main gate, two vehicles approached with headlights turned off, moving slowly and quietly in patterns that suggested tactical training. Jake counted 6 individuals deploying from the vehicles, all carrying what appeared to be automatic weapons and moving with military precision. "Sarah, we've got company," Jake whispered into his radio. 6 armed individuals approaching from the south. "They're not law enforcement." "Confirmed," Sarah replied. "I've got visual on 2 more coming from the East Ridge. These are professionals." "Jake, they're conducting a coordinated assault." Jake felt his heart rate accelerate as the reality of their situation became clear. Sarah's enemies had found her, and they had come prepared for armed resistance. The isolation that had protected Sarah for months was now working against them, giving the attackers time to position themselves without interference from neighbors or passing traffic. But Jake also recognized that the attackers' tactical approach created opportunities for defense. They were treating the ranch like a standard residential target, apparently unaware that Jake and Sarah had been preparing for exactly this scenario. "Initiating defense plan," Jake whispered into his radio, moving to the predetermined position. That would allow him to control access to the main house. The battle for the Morrison Ranch was about to begin. And Jake understood that the outcome would determine not just Sarah's survival, but whether criminals could intimidate law-abiding citizens into silence through violence and terror. Agent Reeves and her tactical team were still 30 minutes away, leaving Jake and Sarah to defend themselves against professional killers who had no intention of taking prisoners. But for the first time since Sarah's arrival at the ranch, Jake felt completely confident about his ability to protect both of them. The isolated ranch that had been Jake's refuge from emotional complications was about to become the battlefield, where Sarah's fight for justice would finally reach its conclusion. And despite the overwhelming odds against them, Jake found himself looking forward to showing Torres' associates what happened when they threatened people under his protection. The long period of hiding and planning was over. Now it was time to fight. The first shots shattered the Montana night at exactly 11:47 p.m. Muzzle flashes erupting from 3 different positions as Torres' men opened fire on the ranch house windows. But instead of finding their targets cowering inside, they discovered that Jake Morrison had learned a few things about tactical warfare during his brief Army service, and Sarah Chun had taught him considerably more during their months of preparation. Jake had positioned himself in the barn's hay loft with a clear field of fire covering the main approach to the house. His grandfather's Winchester hunting rifle wasn't military hardware, but Jake had been shooting since childhood and understood how to use terrain and positioning to maximize his advantages. When the first attacker moved across the open ground between the fence line and the house, Jake's shot dropped him immediately. "One down on the south approach," Jake reported through his radio headset. "Sarah, what's your status?" "2 targets." Moving along the creek bed toward the back of the house, Sarah responded from her position in the root cellar beneath the kitchen. "I've got them bracketed, but they're using the cattle as cover." Sarah's tactical position had been carefully chosen during their planning sessions. The root cellar provided protection from small arms fire while offering firing ports that covered the house's vulnerable rear approach. More importantly, it connected to a tunnel system that Jake's grandfather had built during the Cold War, allowing Sarah to move between defensive positions without exposing herself to enemy fire. The attackers had clearly expected to find a frightened witness hiding in a remote farmhouse, not a coordinated defense conducted by people who understood both the terrain and the principles of small unit tactics. Their initial assault plan began, falling apart within minutes as they encountered resistance from unexpected directions. Jake's second shot disabled the lead vehicle as its driver attempted to reposition for a better assault angle. The heavy caliber hunting round punched through the engine block, sending steam and oil spraying across the gravel driveway. The vehicle's occupants bailed out, seeking cover behind outbuildings that Jake and Sarah had specifically prepared as tactical traps. Vehicle neutralized, Jake reported. But we've got 3 hostiles moving toward the equipment shed. Sarah, can you take the shot? Negative. They're using the propane tanks for cover. Too much risk of explosion. Sarah had identified the critical weakness in their defensive plan. The attackers were professional enough to recognize and exploit the ranch's infrastructure vulnerabilities, using fuel storage and utility equipment to limit Jake and Sarah's ability to engage them directly. But Jake had anticipated this problem during their planning sessions. Instead of trying to eliminate enemies who were using dangerous cover, he would force them to move to positions where Sarah could engage them safely. Jake triggered the first of several improvised explosive devices he'd constructed using agricultural fertilizer and diesel fuel. The explosion wasn't large enough to cause significant structural damage, but it created enough noise and confusion to mask his movement from the barn to a secondary position in the machine shop. Jake, what the hell was that? Sarah's voice carried genuine concern through the radio. Distraction device. Stay in position and watch for runners heading toward your sector. The explosion had the intended effect. 3 attackers broke cover from behind the equipment shed, moving rapidly toward what they assumed was safer ground near the house's foundation. They ran directly into Sarah's kill zone, where her police-issue Glock pistol proved devastatingly effective at close range. 3 more down, Sarah reported with professional calm. But we've still got problems. I count at least 4 more moving through the cattle in the east pasture, and they've got night vision equipment. Jake had feared this development. Torres's organization had access to military-grade surveillance technology that gave them significant advantages during night operations. The motion sensors and improvised lighting systems that Jake had installed around the ranch were useful for detecting intruders, but they couldn't compete with professional night vision optics. But Sarah had anticipated this problem as well, and her solution demonstrated the tactical thinking that had made her an effective undercover detective. Jake, remember the irrigation system controls in the machine shop? Turn on sections 7 through 12 at maximum pressure. I'm going to give our visitors a surprise they won't forget. Jake quickly located the irrigation controls, activating the high-pressure sprinkler systems that watered the pastures where cattle grazed during dry seasons. Within seconds, powerful jets of water were saturating the east pasture, creating muddy conditions that would make movement difficult while simultaneously fouling the night vision equipment the attackers were using. The tactical innovation proved devastating. 4 attackers who had been advancing confidently through the pasture suddenly found themselves struggling through knee-deep mud, while being pelted by high-pressure water that made their night vision goggles useless. They became easy targets for Sarah's precise marksmanship as she engaged them from the tunnel system beneath the house. Outstanding work, Jake reported as he watched the last of the pasture attackers fall. How many are left? At least 2 by my count, but they've gone to ground somewhere near the main gate. They'll be calling for backup and trying to establish radio contact with their base of operations. Jake understood the implications immediately. Torres's organization would have established communication protocols for their assault team, and the failure to report successful completion of their mission would trigger additional response measures. Within hours, the ranch could be surrounded by dozens of professional killers equipped with heavy weapons and aerial surveillance. Sarah, we need to finish this quickly and get out of here before reinforcements arrive. Agreed, but first we need to take prisoners. The FBI needs live witnesses who can provide intelligence about Torres's remaining network. Sarah's law enforcement training was asserting itself even in the middle of armed combat. She understood that eliminating immediate threats was only part of their mission. They also needed to gather evidence that could be used to dismantle the entire criminal organization. Jake admired Sarah's commitment to justice, But he also recognized the practical dangers of attempting to capture professional killers who would certainly prefer death to federal imprisonment. The remaining attackers would be desperate and well-armed, making any capture attempt extremely hazardous. All right, but we do this smart. No unnecessary risks. Jake moved from the machine shop to a position near the main gate, using the ranch's familiar terrain to approach the attacker's last known location. His army training had included basic reconnaissance techniques, and the skills proved useful for stalking human prey in darkness. The first surviving attacker was positioned behind Jake's pickup truck, using the vehicle's engine block for cover, while attempting to establish radio contact with his support team. Jake approached from the rear, moving slowly and quietly through tall grass that concealed his advance. The takedown was swift and silent. Jake used a sleeper hold learned during military hand-to-hand combat training, rendering the attacker unconscious without alerting his companion. Zip tie restraints that Jake had prepared for exactly this purpose secured the prisoner before he could regain consciousness. "One in custody," Jake reported through his radio. Working on the second, the final attacker proved more challenging. He had positioned himself in a drainage culvert that provided excellent cover while offering multiple escape routes. Worse, he appeared to be coordinating with someone via satellite phone, probably arranging for the backup that would doom Jake and Sarah if it arrived before Agent Reeves's tactical team. Sarah solved the problem with characteristic directness. Using the tunnel system, she positioned herself directly beneath the culvert and activated a small explosive charge that had been prepared as a last resort defensive measure. The explosion didn't kill the attacker, but it stunned him sufficiently that Sarah could emerge from the tunnel and take him into custody. "Second prisoner secured," Sarah reported. "But we need to move fast. I heard him talking about helicopter support that's supposed to arrive within the hour." Jake and Sarah quickly transported their prisoners to the ranch house basement, a space that could serve as a temporary holding facility while they waited for Agent Reeves's arrival. Both captives were professional criminals who understood the value of silence, but Sarah's interrogation techniques proved persuasive enough to extract critical intelligence about Torres's remaining operations. The captured men revealed that Torres's organization was much larger than federal investigators had realized, with connections to trafficking networks throughout the western United States and Canada. More immediately relevant, they confirmed that the ranch assault was part of a coordinated effort to eliminate Sarah before she could testify in upcoming federal trials. "There's more coming," one of the prisoners admitted under Sarah's skilled questioning. "Boss man wants this finished tonight. You killed his best people, so now he's sending everyone." Jake felt his stomach clench as he realized their tactical victory had only delayed a larger confrontation. Torres's organization was preparing to commit significant resources to eliminating Sarah, resources that would overwhelm even Agent Reeves's tactical team if they arrived before federal reinforcements could be summoned. "How many?" Sarah pressed. 20. Maybe 30, with helicopters and heavy weapons. "They're treating this like a military operation now." Jake looked at Sarah, seeing his own thoughts reflected in her determined expression. They had approximately 30 minutes before the next wave of attackers arrived, and another 15 minutes before Agent Reeves's tactical team could provide support. The mathematics of the situation were stark. They would be facing overwhelming odds with minimal backup, but Jake also recognized an opportunity in the approaching threat. If Torres's organization was committing significant resources to attacking the ranch, they were also exposing themselves to federal law enforcement response. Agent Reeves could coordinate with other federal agencies to surround and capture the entire assault force, potentially ending the threat to Sarah permanently. "Sarah, we need to contact Agent Reeves immediately and coordinate a larger federal response. If we can hold out until additional backup arrives, we might be able to end this thing tonight." Sarah nodded grimly, understanding that their personal fight had evolved into something much larger. The isolated ranch that had been her sanctuary was about to become the battlefield where federal law enforcement would finally confront Torres's trafficking network directly. As they prepared for the largest fight of their lives, Jake realized that his quiet existence as a lonely rancher was ending forever. Whether they survived or not, he had committed himself to a cause that was bigger than personal safety or comfortable isolation. The battle for justice was about to reach its climax, and Jake Morrison was exactly where he belonged, standing beside the woman he loved, fighting against people who preyed on the innocent and defenseless. Agent Reeves was about to discover just how far a Montana rancher would go to protect the people who mattered to him. At 12:23 a.m., Agent Patricia Reeves arrived at the Morrison Ranch, expecting to find either 2 dead civilians or a quiet extraction operation. What she discovered instead would force her to rewrite everything she thought she knew about Jake Morrison and the capabilities of determined civilians fighting for their lives. The FBI tactical team's approach to the ranch was halted 800 yards from the main gate when Agent Reeves observed the aftermath of what appeared to be a military engagement rather than a criminal assault. Disabled vehicles, scattered equipment, and clear evidence of coordinated defensive operations suggested that Jake and Sarah had not only survived the initial attack, but had completely routed their professional attackers. "Control, this is Reeves." The agent spoke into her radio. "We're going to need crime scene investigation units and additional tactical support. It looks like a war zone down here." Sheriff Marcus Webb, who had insisted on accompanying the federal team despite Agent Reeves's protests, studied the scene through military-grade binoculars with growing amazement. In 15 years of law enforcement, he had never seen such devastation resulting from civilian self-defense. "Jake Morrison did all this?" Webb asked, his voice carrying disbelief. "Jake Morrison and a disabled ex-detective with spinal injuries." Agent Reeves replied grimly, "Against what appears to have been a coordinated assault by 8 professional killers." Webb lowered his binoculars, trying to reconcile the evidence before him with his memories of the quiet rancher who had always seemed more comfortable with cattle than people. "Agent Reeves, I've known Jake since he was 12 years old. He's a good man, but he's not some kind of action hero. There has to be more to this story." Agent Reeves was beginning to reach the same conclusion. The tactical sophistication evident in the ranch's defensive preparation suggested planning and expertise that went far beyond what she would expect from a rancher and an injured detective. Someone had transformed the Morrison Ranch into a fortress designed specifically to defeat professional assault teams. But before Agent Reeves could investigate further, her radio crackled with an urgent transmission from Jake Morrison himself. "Agent Reeves, this is Jake Morrison. We've got 2 prisoners secured and intelligence indicating a much larger assault force is inbound. You need to coordinate with other federal agencies immediately to establish a perimeter and prepare for a significant engagement." The calm professionalism in Jake's voice struck Agent Reeves as completely inconsistent with what she would expect from a civilian who had just survived a life-or-death firefight. Jake sounded like a military commander providing a tactical briefing rather than a frightened rancher calling for help. "Mr. Morrison, this is Agent Reeves. What's your current status?" "Secure. For the moment, but that won't last. The prisoners indicate that Torres's organization is committing 20 to 30 additional personnel with air support and heavy weapons. They're treating this as a military operation to eliminate Sarah before she can testify in federal trials." Agent Reeves felt her blood run cold as she processed the implications of Jake's report. If Torres's organization was indeed mobilizing that level of resources, her 6-person tactical team would be completely inadequate to contain the situation. She needed military support, and she needed it immediately. "Mr. Morrison, I'm calling for federal reinforcements, but it will take time for additional units to arrive." Can you hold your position? Jake's response carried a confidence that sent chills down Agent Reeves's spine. Agent Reeves, Torres's people made a critical mistake when they decided to attack us here. This ranch has been in my family for 3 generations, and we've spent the last 2 months preparing for exactly this scenario. They're about to discover that some fights aren't worth picking. Webb grabbed Agent Reeves's radio microphone before she could respond. Jake, this is Marcus. What the hell is going on down there? And don't give me any tactical briefings. I want to know how a cattle rancher turned into some kind of military operative overnight. There was a long pause before Jake responded, and when he did, his voice carried a weight that Webb had never heard before. Marcus, remember when I enlisted after high school? I didn't just serve as a regular infantryman. I was selected for Special Forces training, and I spent 3 years conducting operations that I'm still not allowed to discuss. I came home and became a rancher because I wanted a peaceful life, not because I didn't know how to fight. The revelation hit Webb like a physical blow. Jake Morrison, the quiet rancher who preferred cattle to people, was a former Green Beret who had hidden his military background for years. Suddenly, the tactical sophistication evident at the ranch made perfect sense. Jesus Christ, Jake, Webb whispered into the radio. Why didn't you ever tell anyone? Because I wanted to leave that life behind, Jake replied. But when someone threatens the people I care about, that old training has a way of reasserting itself. Agent Reeves took back her microphone, her mind racing through the implications of Jake's disclosure. Special Forces veterans possessed exactly the skills and knowledge necessary to transform a rural ranch into an impregnable defensive position. More importantly, they understood how to coordinate with federal law enforcement agencies during complex tactical operations. Mr. Morrison, I need you to brief me on your defensive preparations and your assessment of the incoming threat. If we're going to coordinate an effective response, I need to understand your capabilities. Over the next 10 minutes, Jake provided Agent Reeves with a detailed tactical briefing that demonstrated planning and expertise that impressed even veteran federal agents. The Morrison Ranch had been transformed into a sophisticated defensive complex with overlapping fields of fire, prepared explosive charges, and communication systems that would allow coordination with external support units. Most remarkably, Jake had anticipated the possibility of air assault and had prepared countermeasures that would neutralize helicopter-based attacks. The ranch's high-voltage power lines had been rigged with breakaway connections that could create electrical hazards for low-flying aircraft, while carefully positioned explosive charges could create dust clouds that would blind pilot vision and interfere with aircraft systems. Mr. Morrison, Agent Reeves said when Jake finished his briefing, I need to ask you directly, are you planning to engage this assault force offensively, or are you simply prepared to defend your position? Jake's response would determine whether Agent Reeves would classify him as a valuable ally or a dangerous vigilante who needed to be restrained for his own protection. Agent Reeves, these people have terrorized Sarah for months, and they've made it clear they intend to kill her regardless of law enforcement protection. I'm not going to sit in a bunker and wait for them to find a way to break through our defenses. When they arrive, I'm going to take the fight to them. Sheriff Webb felt his jaw drop as he processed what Jake was proposing. The quiet rancher wasn't just planning to defend himself against criminal attack. He was preparing to conduct offensive military operations against a professional assault force. Jake, you can't be serious, Webb protested. You're talking about fighting a war against people who have military weapons and training. Marcus, I've fought wars against people with military weapons and training. The difference is that this time, I'm fighting to protect someone I love, rather than advance political objectives I never fully understood. Agent Reeves realized that she was facing the decision that would define her entire career. Federal protocol required her to order Jake to stand down and wait for professional law enforcement response. But practical reality suggested that Jake's special forces, training, and intimate knowledge of the ranch terrain made him the most qualified person to coordinate defensive operations until federal reinforcements could arrive. More importantly, Agent Reeves understood that attempting to restrain Jake Morrison would be both futile and counterproductive. The man was clearly committed to protecting Sarah Chun regardless of official instructions, and his military background made him fully capable of conducting independent operations if federal law enforcement refused to cooperate with his plans. Mr. Morrison, I'm going to authorize coordination between your defensive operations and our federal response. But I need your word that you'll follow my tactical guidance and avoid unnecessary risks. You have my word, Agent Reeves. But I should mention that Sarah and I have developed some unconventional approaches to dealing with this threat. When the shooting starts, you might see tactics that don't appear in federal law enforcement manuals. Agent Reeves felt a mixture of anticipation and dread as she considered what Jake might mean by unconventional approaches. Special forces. Veterans were notorious for creative problem-solving that often involved methods that civilian law enforcement agencies preferred not to examine too closely. At 12:47 a.m., the sound of approaching helicopters echoed across the Montana Valley, announcing the arrival of Torres's 2nd Assault Force. Agent Reeves counted at least 3 aircraft, suggesting an airborne assault team of 15 to 20 personnel equipped with military weapons and night vision equipment. But instead of fear or concern, Jake Morrison's voice carried eager anticipation as he contacted Agent Reeves for final coordination. Agent Reeves, this is Morrison. We've got incoming air assets, and it's time to show these people what happens when they threaten law-abiding citizens in Montana. I hope you're ready to see something that will make your federal training manuals look like bedtime stories. Webb stared at the ranch through his binoculars, trying to spot Jake or Sarah in the defensive positions they had prepared. The quiet ranch that had been home to 3 generations of peaceful cattle ranchers was about to become the site of a battle that would test the limits of what one determined man could accomplish when fighting for the people he loved. Agent Reeves, Webb said quietly, I think we're about to discover that there was a lot more to Jake Morrison than any of us ever imagined. The helicopters grew closer, their rotors beating the air with mechanical menace that announced the approaching climax of Sarah Chun's long fight for justice. But Jake Morrison was no longer the lonely rancher who had hired a mysterious housekeeper months earlier. He had become something far more dangerous, a special forces veteran with nothing left to lose and every reason to win. Torres's organization was about to learn the difference between terrorizing helpless victims and attacking someone who knew how to fight back. At 1:03 a.m., the first helicopter crested the eastern ridge and descended toward the Morrison Ranch with the mechanical confidence of predators who had never encountered effective resistance. The pilot banked sharply to begin his assault approach, unaware that Jake Morrison had spent the previous hour transforming his grandfather's peaceful cattle ranch into the most sophisticated aerial denial zone in Montana history. Jake's finger hovered over the detonator that would trigger the first phase of his unconventional air defense system. Through his night vision scope, he watched the lead helicopter establish a firing position 200 feet above the main pasture, its door gunners preparing to unleash devastating suppressive fire on the ranch house and outbuildings. Sarah, confirm. You're in the deep bunker, Jake spoke into his throat microphone, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had conducted similar operations in places the federal government preferred not to discuss. Confirmed and ready, Sarah replied from the reinforced basement shelter that Jake had constructed using techniques learned during counterinsurgency operations in Afghanistan. Jake, that lead helicopter is carrying what looks like a crew-served machine gun. They're not planning to take prisoners. Jake had expected this level of escalation. Torres's organization was treating Sarah's elimination as a military objective that justified the use of weapons typically reserved for battlefield operations. The criminals had made a fatal error in assuming that overwhelming firepower would compensate for poor tactical intelligence about their target. Agent Reeves, you might want to pull your people back another 500 yards, Jake advised through the Federal communication channel. What happens next is going to be loud, bright, and potentially dangerous to anyone within the immediate blast radius. Agent Reeves, positioned on the ridgeline with her tactical team, felt her stomach clench as she realized that Jake's unconventional approaches were about to involve explosive devices of considerable magnitude. Federal law enforcement training had not prepared her for coordinating operations with a civilian who possessed access to military-grade ordnance. Mr. Morrison, please confirm that your defensive measures will not endanger federal personnel or innocent civilians. Agent Reeves spoke into her radio, though she suspected it was too late to influence Jake's tactical decisions. All federal personnel are outside the danger zone, and the nearest civilian residence is 12 miles away, Jake replied with professional precision. Initiating Operation Cattle Guard in 3.2.1. The explosion that followed redefined Agent Reeves's understanding of what was possible in rural Montana. Jake had buried a series of fuel-air explosive devices throughout the ranch's primary helicopter landing zones, creating a coordinated detonation that sent massive fireballs erupting skyward, like volcanic geysers of flame and destruction. The lead helicopter, caught in the expanding fireball, disappeared in a flash of orange light and twisted metal. The pilot of the second aircraft, attempting to gain altitude and escape the unexpected inferno, flew directly into high-voltage power lines that Jake had rigged to discharge their full electrical load on contact. Sheriff Webb watched in stunned silence as the second helicopter's electrical systems failed catastrophically, sending the aircraft spinning out of control before it crashed into the creek bed with bone-jarring impact. Fuel ignited on contact with the aircraft's hot engine components, creating a secondary explosion that illuminated the entire valley. Jesus Christ, Jake, Webb whispered into his radio. What the hell was that? That was what happens when people bring military weapons to a rancher's property without understanding who they're dealing with, Jake replied with grim satisfaction. Sarah, confirm status of the third aircraft. Sarah's voice crackled through the communication system with the controlled excitement of someone who had just witnessed the tide of battle turn decisively in their favor. Third helicopter is attempting to establish a safe landing zone near the main road, but the pilot is clearly rattled. Looks like they're disembarking personnel for a ground assault approach. Jake had anticipated this development as well. Professional assault teams always maintained backup plans for situations where air mobility was compromised, and Torres's remaining personnel would adapt to ground-based tactics that relied on superior numbers and firepower rather than aerial advantage. But Jake's special forces training had included extensive experience with asymmetric warfare against numerically superior forces, and the ranch's terrain offered defensive advantages that professional criminals were unlikely to understand or effectively counter. Agent Reeves, the surviving assault team is going to approach on foot through the western draw, Jake reported with the confidence of someone who had spent months studying every tactical approach to his property. They'll be funneled into a kill zone that I've prepared specifically for ground-based assault. I recommend positioning your tactical team to intercept any survivors who attempt to retreat toward the main road. Agent Reeves found herself following Jake's tactical guidance despite her growing concern about the legal implications of coordinating federal operations with a civilian who was conducting what appeared to be military combat operations on American soil. Mr. Morrison, I need you to understand that federal law enforcement agencies have specific protocols for engaging armed criminals. We cannot sanction the use of deadly force beyond what is necessary for immediate self-defense. Jake's response carried a hard edge that reminded Agent Reeves that she was dealing with someone who had operated in environments where legal niceties were luxuries that combat veterans couldn't afford. "Agent Reeves, these people came to my ranch with crew-served weapons and military explosives with the intention of torturing and murdering a federal witness. They forfeited any claim to legal protection when they decided to conduct a military assault on American citizens. What happens to them now is a consequence of their own choices, not mine." The moral clarity in Jake's voice was both impressive and terrifying. Agent Reeves recognized that Jake Morrison had crossed a psychological threshold that transformed him from a defensive civilian into something approaching a one-man army, motivated by personal loyalty and justified anger. Through her binoculars, Agent Reeves watched Jake emerge from the ranch house and move across the property with tactical proficiency that impressed even veteran federal agents. His movements demonstrated the kind of situational awareness and tactical discipline that took years of professional training to develop. More remarkably, Jake appeared to be enjoying himself for the first time since Agent Reeves had begun monitoring the situation. The transformation from reluctant defender to aggressive combatant suggested that Jake's peaceful ranching life had been a deliberate suppression of skills and instincts that were now being unleashed with devastating effectiveness. At 1:27 a.m., the surviving members of Torres's assault team began their approach through the western draw, moving in tactical formation with the confidence of professionals who had conducted similar operations successfully throughout their criminal careers. They advanced carefully but steadily, using natural cover and established military movement techniques. But Jake had spent 2 months preparing for exactly this scenario, and his defensive preparations transformed the familiar ranch terrain into a gauntlet of carefully positioned threats that would test the limits of professional criminal training. The first surprise came when the assault team triggered motion sensors that Jake had connected to explosive charges buried along their anticipated route of approach. The explosions weren't large enough to cause significant casualties, but they created chaos and confusion that disrupted the team's tactical coordination. While the criminals struggled to regain their formation, Jake opened fire from a concealed position in the equipment barn, using his grandfather's hunting rifle with devastating accuracy. His shots were precisely aimed to disable rather than kill, dropping 3 attackers with non-fatal wounds that removed them from combat, while demonstrating his complete tactical control of the engagement. "Agent Reeves, I've got 3 wounded hostiles in the western draw who need medical attention," Jake reported with professional calm. "The remaining 5 are attempting to flank through the cattle pasture, where they'll encounter additional defensive measures." Sarah's voice joined the tactical communication network as she emerged from her shelter to provide supporting fire from the house's reinforced basement windows. "Jake, 2 of the flanking team are carrying what appears to be rocket-propelled grenades. They're positioning for an attack on the main house." Jake's response demonstrated the kind of tactical creativity that had made him valuable during special forces operations in hostile territory. Instead of attempting to counter the rocket attack directly, he triggered explosive charges that opened the cattle gates throughout the eastern pasture. Reeves watched in amazement as 200 head of Black Angus cattle, startled by the explosions and confused by the unfamiliar lights and sounds, began stampeding directly toward the position where Torres's remaining personnel were attempting to establish firing positions, the sight of a cattle stampede charging through the darkness toward their position proved more psychologically devastating to the professional criminals than any conventional military tactic could have achieved. The assault team's tactical discipline collapsed as individual members broke ranks to escape the approaching herd. "That's something you don't see in federal training manuals," Agent Reeves observed with grudging admiration as she watched Jake's unconventional defensive strategy scatter his attackers across the ranch property. Sheriff Webb, who had remained silent throughout the engagement, finally found his voice as he processed what he had witnessed. Agent Reeves, I need to ask you officially, are we watching legitimate self-defense? Or are we witnessing Jake Morrison conduct some kind of military operation that exceeds the legal boundaries of civilian defensive action? The question struck at the heart of Agent Reeves's growing concern about her role in the evening's events. Jake Morrison had demonstrated tactical capabilities that went far beyond anything that federal law enforcement protocols were designed to address. His actions were undeniably effective, but they also raised serious questions about the legal framework governing civilian use of military tactics and equipment. Sheriff Webb, I honestly don't know, Agent Reeves admitted. What I do know is that Jake Morrison has single-handedly neutralized a military-level assault by professional criminals who were attempting to murder a federal witness. Whether his methods were strictly legal is a question for federal prosecutors to decide after we've secured the scene and taken survivors into custody. As dawn began to break over the Montana Valley, the Morrison Ranch presented a scene that would challenge federal investigators for months to come. Jake Morrison had transformed a criminal assault into a one-sided demonstration of superior tactical planning and execution. But he had also revealed capabilities that raised fundamental questions about his background and the extent of his military training. Most importantly, he had protected Sarah Chun and demonstrated that certain threats to law-abiding citizens would be met with overwhelming and decisive force. Torres's organization had learned too late that some fights were more dangerous than they appeared, and some targets were better left alone. The lonely rancher who had wanted nothing more than a peaceful life with his cattle had become something far more formidable when circumstances required it. And Agent Reeves was beginning to understand that Jake Morrison's story was far from overdone in the pale light of dawn on October 15th, 2018. The Morrison Ranch resembled a battlefield more than a cattle operation. Smoke rose from multiple crash sites. Emergency vehicles lined the access road, and federal agents moved carefully through debris fields while documenting evidence of what would become known as the Montana incident in classified government files. Agent Patricia Reeves stood beside the smoldering wreckage of the first helicopter, her mind struggling to process the tactical sophistication that had transformed a routine witness protection crisis into a military engagement that would require congressional oversight to fully investigate. The destruction wasn't random or chaotic. It was the result of carefully planned defensive systems that demonstrated expertise far beyond anything in Jake Morrison's official military records. Agent Reeves called Special Agent David Chun, the FBI Senior Explosive Ordnance Disposal Specialist who had been helicoptered in from Denver to assess the scene. You need to see what we found in the ranch house basement. Agent Reeves followed Chun down a concealed stairway that led to a subterranean facility she hadn't known existed during the previous night's coordination efforts. The basement had been transformed into a sophisticated command center with communication equipment, weapons storage, and tactical planning materials that belonged in a military installation rather than a private residence. This isn't improvised preparation, Chun observed, examining the professional-grade equipment and systematic organization. Someone spent months, maybe years, establishing a fully functional combat operations center beneath this house. The construction techniques and equipment selection suggest someone with access to classified military specifications. Agent Reeves studied detailed topographical maps that covered the walls, noting tactical annotations and defensive planning that extended far beyond the ranch's immediate boundaries. Jake Morrison had created contingency plans for multiple threat scenarios, including federal government intervention and international criminal pursuit. Most disturbing were the communications logs that documented Jake's contact with individuals whose names appeared in classified databases as former Special Forces personnel who had disappeared from official records after conducting operations that the government preferred not to acknowledge publicly. Agent Reeves, Chun continued, his voice carrying professional concern, I've processed combat zones in Iraq and Afghanistan that were less sophisticated than what Jake Morrison constructed here. Either this man has resources and training that aren't reflected in his official background, or he's been receiving assistance from people with access to current military technology and intelligence. The implication sent chills through Agent Reeves as she realized that the previous night's engagement might have been a carefully orchestrated operation designed to eliminate Torres's organization while providing Jake Morrison with official cover for actions that would otherwise be considered vigilante justice. Upstairs, Sheriff Marcus Webb was conducting his own investigation into the man he thought he had known for 26 years. Jake Morrison sat calmly at his kitchen table, drinking coffee and answering questions with the patient cooperation of someone who had nothing to hide. But Webb sensed layers of deception beneath his old friend's straightforward responses. "Jake, I need to ask you directly," Webb said, settling into the chair across from the man who had just conducted what appeared to be a military operation against professional criminals. "Who exactly are you?" Jake's smile carried genuine warmth, but his eyes held depths that Webb had never noticed during their years of friendship. "I'm exactly who I've always been, Marcus. A rancher who wants to live quietly and take care of his cattle. The difference is that some situations require skills I learned before I came home to Montana. Skills like constructing fuel-air explosive devices and coordinating multi-phase defensive operations against helicopter assault teams. Skills like protecting the people I care about when the legal system isn't sufficient to ensure their safety." Jake replied with quiet intensity. "Sarah Chun risked her life to stop criminals who destroy innocent people's lives. When those criminals came to my ranch to kill her, I used every resource at my disposal to make sure that didn't happen." Webb studied Jake's face, searching for signs of the man he thought he knew beneath the tactical competence that had been revealed during the night's events. "Jake, what you did here goes beyond self-defense. You conducted a military operation on American soil using weapons and tactics that federal agencies are going to spend months investigating." "What I did," Jake corrected firmly, "was defend my home against criminals who came here with military weapons and the intention to commit murder. If my response was disproportionate to their threat, then perhaps they should have considered that possibility before deciding to attack federal witnesses with crew-served weapons and explosive devices." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a black SUV carrying federal officials whose credentials indicated involvement with agencies that Sheriff Webb recognized but had never dealt with directly. The lead official, a stern woman in her 50s who introduced herself only as Director Walsh, immediately took control of the investigation with authority that superseded Agent Reeves's local jurisdiction. "Sheriff Webb, I need you to secure this scene and prevent any media access until our investigation is complete," Director Walsh ordered with the expectation of immediate compliance. "What happened here last night has national security implications that require careful management." Webb felt his law enforcement instincts bristling at being displaced by federal officials, who seemed more concerned with controlling information than pursuing justice. "Director Walsh, Jake Morrison is a citizen of my county who defended himself against criminal attack. I have a responsibility to ensure that his rights are protected during any investigation." Director Walsh's expression suggested that Sheriff Webb's concerns were irrelevant complications that she would address efficiently and finally. "Sheriff, Jake Morrison's rights will be protected in accordance with federal protocols governing situations that involve classified military capabilities and international criminal organizations. Your cooperation is appreciated, but not required." The bureaucratic dismissal angered Webb more than any criminal behavior he had encountered during his law enforcement career. Jake Morrison had risked his life to protect a federal witness and had successfully neutralized a threat that federal agencies had been unable to contain through conventional methods. Instead of gratitude, He was receiving treatment that suggested he had committed crimes rather than prevented them. Meanwhile, in the ranch house's main bedroom, Sarah Chun was undergoing her own federal debriefing with agents whose questions focused more on Jake's capabilities than on Torres's criminal organization. The interrogation techniques were polite but persistent, designed to extract information about Jake's background and resources without appearing to question his patriotism or legal status. Ms. Chun, during your time at the Morrison Ranch, did Mr. Morrison ever discuss military operations or contacts with individuals who might have access to classified weapons technology? Asked Agent Jennifer Brooks, a federal investigator whose specialty appeared to be assessing civilian access to restricted military resources. Sarah recognized the direction of the questioning and understood that federal agencies were more concerned about Jake's demonstration of tactical capabilities than they were about eliminating the remaining members of Torres's organization. The realization that Jake might face federal prosecution for protecting her filled Sarah with rage that she struggled to control. Agent Brooks, Jake Morrison saved my life and eliminated a criminal organization that your federal agencies were unable to stop through conventional law enforcement methods. If you're planning to prosecute him for being more effective than the FBI, then you need to re-examine your priorities. Ms. Chun, no one is suggesting that Mr. Morrison will face prosecution. We're simply trying to understand how a civilian rancher acquired the training and resources necessary to conduct the operations we witnessed last night. Sarah's response carried the authority of someone who had spent years working within federal law enforcement systems. Jake Morrison is a former Special Forces soldier who used his military training to defend his home against criminal attack. If federal agencies are surprised by his capabilities, perhaps they should review their own intelligence gathering procedures. But Sarah understood that the federal investigation represented more than bureaucratic curiosity about Jake's background. Government agencies were assessing whether Jake Morrison represented a potential threat to federal authority, someone whose demonstrated capabilities might encourage other civilians to take matters into their own hands when government protection proved inadequate. The bureaucratic machinery that was descending on the Morrison Ranch would determine whether Jake would be recognized as a hero who had protected a federal witness or classified as a dangerous civilian who possessed capabilities that threatened government monopoly on military force. By mid-morning, the ranch was crawling with federal investigators, military specialists, and government officials whose presence transformed Jake's home into something resembling a hostile occupation. The man who had wanted nothing more than a quiet life with his cattle found himself at the center of a federal investigation that would determine whether his actions were considered patriotic service or domestic terrorism. Jake watched the organized chaos from his front porch, drinking coffee and observing the systematic documentation of his defensive preparations with the calm detachment of someone who had anticipated this development. He had known that protecting Sarah would require accepting consequences that extended far beyond the immediate threat from Torres's organization. The question now was whether the federal government would recognize his actions as justified defense of a witness or classify him as a civilian who had overstepped legal boundaries in ways that challenged government authority. The answer would determine not only Jake's future, but the precedent for how American citizens could defend themselves when government protection proved insufficient. As federal investigators continued their work, Jake Morrison faced the possibility that saving Sarah Chun's life might cost him his freedom, his ranch, and everything he had built during his years of peaceful isolation. But watching Sarah move freely around the ranch without fear for the first time since her arrival, Jake understood that some sacrifices were worth making regardless of their personal cost. The battle against Torres's organization was over, but the fight for Jake Morrison's freedom was just beginning. 3 hours into the federal investigation, at precisely 10:30 a.m. on October 15, 2018, Jake Morrison walked into his kitchen where Director Walsh was conducting interviews and made an announcement that would redefine everything. Sheriff Marcus Webb thought he knew about government authority, military service, and the true meaning of protecting American citizens. Director Walsh, Jake said, with the calm authority of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment. I think it's time you learned who you're really dealing with. Jake placed a weathered leather portfolio on the kitchen table, its contents secured with classification markings that made Director Walsh's eyes widen with recognition. The documents inside would explain not only Jake's tactical capabilities, but why his actions at the ranch fell under federal jurisdiction that even Director Walsh didn't have authority to investigate. Sheriff Webb, Jake continued, turning to his old friend who had been relegated to observer status during the federal takeover. What I'm about to tell you is classified at levels that require congressional oversight to discuss. But given that you've witnessed events that are going to generate questions for years to come, you deserve to understand the truth. Sheriff Webb felt his pulse accelerate as Jake opened the portfolio to reveal documents bearing seals and signatures. That indicated involvement with government agencies whose existence was not publicly acknowledged. The papers contained mission reports, commendations, and operational summaries that painted a picture of military service far beyond anything Jake had ever mentioned. Agent Reeves, Director Walsh, I need you to contact Deputy Director Harrison at the CIA and confirm authentication code Tango 77 Alpha, Jake said, providing information that sent both federal officials reaching for secure communication devices. He's been expecting this call since last night. Director Walsh's expression transformed from bureaucratic authority to genuine concern as she processed the implications of Jake's classification code. CIA Deputy Director Harrison was not someone who involved himself in routine federal investigations, and his connection to events at the Morrison Ranch suggested complexities that exceeded anything in Director Walsh's briefing materials. The secure phone conversation that followed lasted 12 minutes, during which Director Walsh's responses indicated she was receiving information that fundamentally altered her understanding of Jake Morrison's background and the federal government's relationship to his actions at the ranch. Sheriff Webb, Director Walsh said after ending her call, her voice carrying a respect that had been completely absent during her earlier interactions. I need to apologize for treating this as a routine civilian self-defense investigation. Jake Morrison is not a former Special Forces soldier who exceeded legal boundaries. He's a current federal operative whose actions last night were conducted under authority that supersedes local and state jurisdiction. The revelation hit Sheriff Webb like a physical blow. Jake Morrison, the quiet rancher who had been his friend for over 2 decades, was an active federal agent whose apparent retirement to civilian life had been an extended undercover assignment. Jake, Webb said, his voice carrying betrayal and confusion. Are you telling me that our entire friendship has been a lie? That you've been spying on our community for years? Jake's expression softened with genuine emotion as he addressed the man who had been his closest friend during years of carefully maintained deception. Marcus, my friendship with you has been the most genuine relationship of my adult life. But you're right that I haven't been completely honest about my circumstances. Jake gestured toward the documents that Director Walsh was reviewing with obvious amazement. After my official discharge from the Army, I was recruited by a joint CIA-FBI task force that monitors international criminal organizations operating within the United States. My assignment was to establish a credible civilian identity while maintaining surveillance capabilities in rural areas that are often used by smuggling and trafficking operations. The Morrison Ranch has been a federal monitoring station for 8 years, Jake continued. When Sarah Chun arrived here seeking protection, it wasn't coincidence. Federal agencies had been tracking Torres's organization for months, and they knew that Sarah would eventually need a safe location where she could recover while maintaining her ability to provide testimony. Sheriff Webb felt his understanding of the past decade crumbling as he processed Jake's revelations. So Sarah's arrival, the attack, everything that happened here was orchestrated by federal agencies? Not orchestrated, Jake corrected, but anticipated and prepared for. Federal intelligence knew that Torres's organization would eventually locate Sarah, and they needed a location where the confrontation could be controlled and documented without endangering civilians or compromising ongoing investigations. Agent Reeves, who had been silent throughout Jake's briefing, finally found her voice. "Mr. Morrison, are you saying that last night's engagement was a federal operation designed to eliminate Torres's remaining personnel while providing legal justification for their deaths?" Jake's response carried the weight of someone who had spent years conducting operations that existed in legal gray areas between law enforcement and military action. Agent Reeves, Torres's organization represented a threat to federal witnesses and ongoing criminal investigations that conventional law enforcement methods couldn't adequately address. Sometimes protecting American citizens requires approaches that don't appear in standard federal procedures manuals. Director Walsh finished reviewing Jake's documents and looked up with an expression that combined professional admiration with personal concern. Sheriff Webb, Jake Morrison's actions last night eliminated a criminal organization that federal agencies had been unable to neutralize through conventional means. His methods were unorthodox, but they achieved objectives that would have required months of additional investigation and potentially endangered dozens of federal personnel. The bureaucratic vindication felt hollow to Sheriff Webb, who was struggling with the realization that his closest friend had been deceiving him for years, while conducting federal operations in his jurisdiction without his knowledge or consent. "Jake, I need to ask you directly, how many other people in our community are federal agents? How many of my relationships are based on professional deception rather than genuine friendship?" Jake's answer provided the personal honesty that Webb desperately needed. "Marcus, you've been the only person in Montana who knew me as something other than a federal operative. Our friendship gave me anchors to normal human relationships that I needed to maintain my sanity during years of undercover work. If I deceived you about my professional obligations, it was because preserving our friendship was more important to me than maintaining perfect operational security." Sarah Chun, who had been listening to Jake's revelations with her own mixture of surprise and understanding, finally spoke up with a question that addressed the fundamental issue underlying the entire investigation. "Jake, if you're a federal agent, why didn't you simply arrange official protection for me instead of allowing me to believe I was hiding independently? Why conduct this elaborate deception?" Jake's response revealed the personal motivation that had transformed a professional assignment into something far more meaningful. "Sarah, when you arrived at the ranch, you were a federal witness who needed protection. But over the months we spent together, you became the most important person in my life. What started as a professional obligation became personal in ways that complicated my federal responsibilities. When Torres's people finally located you, I had to choose between following federal protocols that would have prioritized your testimony over your personal safety, or using every resource at my disposal to ensure that you survived regardless of the impact on ongoing investigations." Director Walsh interjected with professional concern. "Agent Morrison, that choice placed you in violation of federal protocols governing the protection of witnesses and the use of classified resources for personal objectives." Jake's smile carried the satisfaction of someone who had anticipated this bureaucratic challenge and prepared appropriate responses. "Director Walsh, I followed federal protocols exactly. My instructions were to protect Sarah Chun by any means necessary while gathering intelligence about Torres's operational methods and personnel. Last night's engagement accomplished both objectives while eliminating threats that conventional law enforcement couldn't adequately address." Sheriff Webb listened to this exchange with growing amazement as he realized that Jake had managed to protect Sarah while fulfilling his federal obligations in ways that his superiors couldn't officially criticize. The lonely rancher who had seemed to stumble into heroic circumstances had actually orchestrated events to achieve outcomes that served both personal and professional objectives. Agent Morrison, Director Walsh said formally, your methods were effective, but they've created documentation and evidence challenges that will require extensive coordination between multiple federal agencies. The public story about these events will need careful management to avoid encouraging similar civilian-military actions. Jake nodded understanding. The official report will indicate that federal agents successfully protected a witness during an assault by international criminals, with assistance from local law enforcement and a civilian consultant with relevant military background. And the truth? Sheriff Webb asked. The truth, Jake replied with genuine warmth, is that a rancher fell in love with his housekeeper and was willing to fight the entire world to protect her. Everything else is just paperwork. Sarah stepped forward and took Jake's hand, her smile indicating that his professional deceptions were forgiven in light of his personal commitment to her safety. So what happens now? Do you continue your federal assignment, or do you become the rancher you've been pretending to be? Jake's answer surprised everyone in the room. I'm resigning from federal service, effective immediately. I've spent 8 years pretending to be someone I'm not. And I've discovered that the person I was pretending to be is who I actually want to become. Director Walsh protested immediately. Agent Morrison, you're one of our most effective operatives. The agency can't afford to lose someone with your capabilities and experience. Director Walsh, the agency will survive without me. But I won't survive without Sarah, and she deserves a husband who can be completely honest about who he is and what he does for a living. Sheriff Webb felt his world stabilizing as he recognized the Jake Morrison he had always known beneath the federal operative who had been revealed. Jake, are you asking Sarah to marry you? I'm asking Sarah to help me figure out how to be a real rancher instead of someone who just plays one for the federal government, Jake replied, turning to face the woman who had transformed his life. But yes, Marcus, I'm hoping she'll marry me and help me learn what it means to build a life based on truth instead of deception. Sarah's answer came without hesitation. Jake Morrison, you're the most complicated, dangerous, and thoroughly decent man I've ever met. Of course I'll marry you. As federal officials continued their documentation and Sheriff Webb processed the revelations that had redefined his understanding of his best friend, Jake Morrison achieved something that had seemed impossible just hours earlier. He had protected the woman he loved, fulfilled his federal obligations, and found a way to build a future based on honesty rather than operational necessity. The lonely rancher who had wanted nothing more than a quiet life with his cattle had discovered that some complications were worth embracing, especially when they came with love, purpose, and the opportunity to use his skills in service of something more meaningful than professional duty. Sheriff Marcus Webb, witnessing the transformation of his friend from federal operative back to genuine rancher, understood that he had just observed one of the most remarkable stories of his law enforcement career. What Jake Morrison did next had indeed shocked the sheriff, but it had also restored his faith in the possibility that government service and personal integrity could coexist when guided by love and commitment to protecting innocent people. The Morrison Ranch would return to raising cattle, but it would never again be just another ranch in Montana. It would be home to 2 people who had found each other while fighting for justice, and who had chosen love over duty when circumstances forced them to decide between professional obligations and personal happiness. In the end, that choice had shocked everyone who witnessed it, including the sheriff who thought he knew what heroism looked like. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.